Good morning. We're glad you made it to day 2 of our HESED conference. I am Marta Pomeroy, Junior MDiv student here at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary from Cedar Rapids in Marion, Iowa. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this morning. There'll be time at the end for a question and answer session, but feel free to make comments and ask questions in the hop-in chat, and I'll pose them at the end. Thank you for being with us and participating today. Elona Street-Stewart, Delaware Nanticoke, is a ruling elder and active church member in St. Paul, Minnesota. She is a Synod executive for the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, having already been Synod program staff for over 20 years. Elona has served the PCUSA on racial justice matters and mission development, denominational policies, and educational programs since 1980. She has been engaged for 4 decades in grassroots and national advocacy on racial equity, Indian education, family empowerment, and public policy. Elona has received many honors, including the Minnesota American Indian Parent of the Year in 1998, a National PW Women of Faith Award 2010, and a Peacemaker Award in recognition of Mahatma Gandhi's 147th birthday. She was the first Native American elected to an urban school board in Minnesota, serving on the St. Paul School Board for 3 terms from 2001 to 2013, as well as the first to be installed as a Synod executive for the PCUSA. She received the 2018 Alumna Seal Award from Occidental College for Professional Excellence Service to Community in 2018. Elona was elected as co-moderator of the 224 General Assembly PCUSA, along with Reverend Gregory Bentley in June 2020. Macalester College conferred an honorary doctorate of humane letters for Elona in June of 2021. An Upward Bound student from Philadelphia, an Occidental College graduate, Elona and her husband, Reverend David Stewart, have 4 children, and as of yesterday, I just found out 5 grandchildren. Elona is one of the reasons I am here at seminary today. I met her at a white privilege conference in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 2018. It was her warmth and hospitality that invited me in, and her wisdom that has kept me engaged each and every time we're together. It is my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Elona Street-Stewart.
Well, thank you, my sister Marta. It is a pleasure to be joining you there in Austin this morning. God's blessings on all of you at this time as you come together to listen and learn and lead. It's important for me as I accepted this invitation to recognize always those who lived here in this area before we came together today. Those who were the first stewards of the land. As an American Indian, I have to say that all land has a tribal story. And so I begin today by saying, let's remember it as the home to Indigenous people all over this continent, that there are diverse communities that were forced to relocate, that some of those people may never have left. And there were people who walked on many trails of tears to different lands. And also there in Texas, there were many who disappeared before we ever knew their names. It's always good to recognize the people whose land we are on, and that to get here today and meet here in this place, whether in person or on the screen, each of us traveled through what was the ancestral land of Indigenous people. You are on Native land. The land remembers. It's important to remember this history and the precipitating injustices and processes of annihilation as we move to a more just and accessible, welcoming and accountable HESED environment. In the last 2 centuries, the land where you are held the footprints and the songs of the Caddo, the Tonkawa, the Lipan Apache, Comanche, and other nations. Why is it, I ask, that unlike most Western states, Texas has almost no Indian land? Other than the 3 reserved communities, tribes there were either decimated or driven out. Do you realize that you're walking and driving and studying in places of immoral enslavement by church institutions, and systemic warfare of Texas and the United States against Indigenous people. But there's good news to share as well. The return of buffalo by the Tonka Fund program to the Lipan Apache in the last couple of years feels like the prayers of our ancestors are being fulfilled. This partnership reflects the rematriation of our relatives and a reconnection with each other as Indigenous people. Buffalo were slaughtered to make way for the railroad and the settlers it carried. But actions like this create a tangible response to the racial injustice and economic oppression of the last century, restoring, repairing, and reimagining a very different future. And like the African concept of the Sankofa bird, drawn with her head turned around, holding an egg in her mouth, meaning if we want to survive, we should retrieve things of value from our knowledge of the past as we move to the future. And so with our feet facing forward, we look back, grasp the resilience and self-determination of the buffalo to provide for tomorrow's generation. Native traditions remind us that today's children really are living messengers that we send into the future, to a future that we will never see. And like the buffalo, we must retrieve them, restore them, and return them to bring healing so the people can face the future and survive. So I'm grateful for this time to listen, learn, and lead together, or using the HESED construct to focus on truth-telling, education, and reparative actions. Will we become who and what God needs from us at this time? Will we hear justice reminding us to look back and be transformed before we move forward? As we reflect on who we are and where we come from, what wisdom from the past do we need to retrieve and carry with us to the future? What good news, what loving kindness is growing in us like seeds of hope for the world? When I speak about our responsibility as a church community to faithfully and courageously live out God's abundant gifts for all, to offer the truth of Jesus's word every day to everyone in God's kingdom, I'm saying, I'll stand up and bring my people with me. Theologian Patrick Reyes writes, "To learn and tell the story of our ancestors is a privilege that only those who survive long enough get to tell. For those of us who do survive to adulthood, passing on wisdom is a matter of life and death. By grounding ourselves in our traditions, we are able to draw on wisdom from those stories that inspire us to survive. Of course, these stories include the narratives of our own families, but we're inspired to survive from other places as well, because we breathe and live and exist in many spaces. All those spaces we occupy as activists or even by accident, maybe by birth, they ground us in a community with others whom God has called to life." So can we discard the old wineskins and see what Jesus offers the church today? What will it take to go beyond divisive but shallow conversations about what's happening, to fully incorporate diversity, equity, and racial justice in our churches, organizations, and communities? There won't be any progress if we continue to address poverty, racism, violence, international conflict, and natural disasters by individual will without structural change. And we can't make change or act as disciples if we're not aware of and engaged in the world, meeting and listening and learning outside of ourselves to understand just how much what we do impacts everyone. One of my minister friends in the Self-Development of People program puts it this way: to ensure that laws are fair and practice justice every day. Reparations for ill-gotten gains, such as unpaid labor, stolen land, false news, or military invasions, call us to be both warrior and healer. We must combine the defiant protection and strategic advocacy of the warrior with the spiritual reckoning and holistic medicine of the healer. We are called to be life givers, to bear stories of resilience and truth and hope, to remind, restore, and reimagine. But how do we do it? This is what the disciples wanted to know and what churches and leaders want to know. This is what you want to know and what I want to know. When those around Jesus asked him what they should do, he proclaimed, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor." And when they asked him what was the greatest commandment, he said, "First, seek the kingdom of God. Do this by loving the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind." And there's still more. Seek the righteousness of God, which means to love your neighbor as yourself. He focused on reconciling systems of oppression and repairing the harm that was caused by slavery, marginalization, poverty, and Roman occupation, and wanted the people to see God's goodness, making a new beginning, restoring a community of people who shared with their neighbors, who graciously deliver justice for the poor, who protect the vulnerable, who participate in the righteous administration of basic goods, social power, and critical infrastructure. Jesus challenged his followers to ask, who actually be good for people? So don't just talk about what Jesus did, do what Jesus did. And actually, I think the question is, am I doing enough? So do all you can to dismantle structural racism and eradicate systemic poverty. Then practice, practice, practice your actions that lead communities back to responsible earth care and strengthen Black, Indigenous, and other people of color-led infrastructures for social change. The primary principle is to build structural accountability and well-being and equity in the church, our institutions, in our networks, in our governance, and in our communities. While there are a variety of approaches to encourage, sustain, and support HESED, we hope our efforts to practice more will generate an alignment of people, places, and purpose. Now, we know as students there, education through critical analysis and data-based research increases knowledge. But I'm going to tell you, unless it deconstructs and sheds any historical bias of who is most deserving to benefit and who isn't, it will not increase the ability to equitably transfer knowledge, while at the same time to be willing to constructively assess it. I ask, do educational cost, specifically your repayment plans as students, do those build a foundation of support and access for future generations in BIPOC communities? Can costs be supplemented by service opportunities instead to your community? And while most institutions seek transitional hires now to lead, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, do these local efforts actually impact specific input for students and staff to experience DEI in the community before they arrive? Right now, I'm going to tell you, I think it's important to create and protect benchmarks and procedures to evaluate, dismantle, challenge, and recalculate the financial products and services that control capital to investments available to historically marginalized community. With those benchmarks and procedures under your watchful eye, I also say stay rooted in your community. Engage, show up, sign up, volunteer, partner, collaborate in place. Welcome every opportunity to connect where you can contribute and receive. Local churches and other houses of worship, in market co-ops, in arts opportunities, dealing with public safety, and all of the community wellness around you. Because you must boldly confront injustice with truth. Do all you can and when you can. And I'm going to share this with you out of my elder wisdom. When you are distressed and weary of working on racialized injustice or environmental disasters, violence, war, and evil, when you've got to go through a lot of stuff in order to express yourself, when you feel you can no longer keep up the routine facade of daily work, study, deadlines, pandemic fears, or feel that you've been dismissed and disrespected, don't bear that fatigue alone. I want you to find your sacred place or listen to the sacred word and call on your people to come with you. Shut the door when you all get together and weep and embrace each other as long as you need until together you can start to heal and are filled with hope and restore the Ubuntu of your community. Another thing I also want to remind you about is that don't let an election go by without voting. Know your voting rights history and currently all the evolving laws around voter participation. And I want you today to recognize Elizabeth Perodovich. She was a Tlingit woman from Alaska, a civil rights activist and a Presbyterian who fought and led the first Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945 in Alaska, ushering in a whole new era of state anti-discrimination laws in the United States. Listen to her words. Back then, she said, "No law will eliminate crimes, but at least you as legislators can assert to the world that you recognize the evil of the present situation and speak your intent to overcome discrimination." She said that on the floor of the assembly. We need leaders like that today. It wasn't until 2 decades later that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed in our country. Again, think what she's told those elected officials. Recognize evil, speak our intent, and overcome discrimination. Now, I'm glad to say that her father was a Presbyterian lay minister. She attended Sheldon Jackson, which at the time was a Presbyterian-related college. But more important, she became a lifelong defender for Native rights and economic justice. And so next year, on February 16th, I want you to set aside some time that day to recognize her and all these achievements she had. And if you're lucky, maybe in your pocket, you'll have a $1 gold coin with her image on it. It's important in this whole process of being represented and participating in the representation process to remember, lament, and repent the minimizing or erasure of the contributions of other people, like Dr. Martin Luther King or Fred Shuttlesworth or Medgar Evers or Fannie Lou Hamer or Ida B. Wells and Ella Baker, James Foreman, John Lewis, Dolores Huerta, Sandra Cisneros, Rodolfo Gonzalez, Berta Casares, and so many more. They've all been protectors who were silenced, muted, beaten, bombed, arrested, jailed, or even killed for the right to vote and be represented. So I want you to internalize their bio narratives so that you are always ready to respond quickly when you begin to hear rhetoric or misinformation, and so that you will increase awareness of current discriminatory practices. Share their writings and their art and put it on your shelves to decolonize your workplace and your study place with their presence. This is all about seeking, restoring, and sustaining space for liberation. Now, in particular, I want that to be land for diverse and marginalized communities where they can express their own identities and determine their futures, not a place where they'll just simply be tolerated, accepted, or even worse, showcased. John Cortansel, who's a professor of Indigenous Studies up at the University of Victoria, he talks about the need to go from geographies of selective exclusion to geographies of kinship that can renew spiritual and relational responsibilities. Your makerspace should be doing that. So we know as white supremacy reemerges in our consciousness and today in our public spaces, it's critical that parks and reserves, our waterways, our meadows, and our mountains call for relief from this constant burden of exploitation. That's what Vine Deloria, our Dakota elder, pointed out years ago. And Huey Newton, in his lifetime, pointed out that our hopes for freedom then lie in the future, where a human world society structured to benefit all the Earth's people. I share all these comments from our elders because justice and truth cannot be reconciled in spaces that perpetuate the suffering of people, Indigenous, Black, Brown, poor people, LGBTQ people, underrepresented people. Those spaces need to be restored, repaired, revived, and resurrected as well. Individuals, churches, and organizations all can play a leading role in reforming our national culture and our theological education by acknowledging the church's role in the business of land theft, slavery, genocide, and racialized poverty. And secondly, by pointing a way forward through specific objectives in education, advocacy, and economic responsibility, not for punishment or charity, but as a way to use privilege to restore wholeness for what is due. Now, some of you follow Courtney Ariel. She's a songwriter and a storyteller. She wrote the book about, becoming white allies. I like the way she says it. She says, privilege means you owe a debt. You inherited it. You probably didn't ask for it. And you probably didn't pay for it either. But no one's blaming you for having it. You're lovely humans. You're amazing. Being a citizen of a society requires work from everyone within that society. So I'm going to say it's up to you whether you choose to acknowledge the work that it's yours to do. It's up to you whether you choose to pay this debt and how you choose to do so. Like your words, Ariel. It may mean marching or writing a story, maybe building a shelter or changing bank policies, removing redlining covenant clauses in your mortgages. Maybe it's offering legal assistance or modeling Wakanja Kiwakampi, which is a Dakota word around our children are sacred. And this is to equip people to provide intervention and conflict resolution in public spaces for the sake of our children. Thank God our elders were already thinking years ago about social conflict and how to address it today. Or maybe we need to reimagine alternative intervention for our youth who are put in justice systems. You know, one good alternative intervention would be more jobs for them. So as I begin to close on our truth telling, which is listening, and education, which is learning, and reparative action, which is leading together, I offer these last two lenses in response to the ideas about moving towards being HESED by becoming anti-racist. Any other initiatives, including but not limited to, I'm going to list them, equity conversations, resolutions, proclamations, street name changes, pulpit swaps, diversity dinners, and land acknowledgement. If they're not clearly and intentionally focused on dismantling white supremacy and acts of hatred, they're just simply distractions for your work. These actions may have nothing to do with reality bringing about the liberation and the self-determination of Black, brown, and poor people. And for Indigenous folk, they may actually further serve to harm by pushing, again, assimilation strategies or extermination. So listening and learning across cultures isn't just showing up for ceremonies or marches. To be honest, a lot of that is just cultural misappropriation, or what we call cultural hitchhiking. You need to advocate for our interest in all the other places where you are and we can't be. So don't borrow our culture without understanding our struggles. And lastly, I share with you, it's going to take more than one book, one conference, one march, one group, one all-night conversation to really transform how we choose to live as HESED people. Start by refuting today's iterations of the doctrines of domination. Study the origin of Christendom's doctrine of discovery and the justification to possess and enslave people and lands since the 1500s. Let's carry that all the way to where we are now. Listen more and resist responding with ideas or insight that may silence or displace other voices. What I'm saying, in other words, when you're coming together in communities, resist dominating conversations to show how much you're not racist. BIPOC people have long experienced systemic violence and oppressive trauma. We have seen how inherent that is in systems. Systemic racism for centuries is part of our people's histories. And right now, exposing that is important. And so those who are determined to stop racism, after we've been dealing with it for 500 years, are now shocked about the brutality of systems because it's never happened to them before, or because they can't imagine it happening around where they are. And so I caution you, when you're engaged, please avoid saying expressions like, I can't believe that something like this would happen in this day and age. We heard that said all over the place around school shootings. That can't happen in our suburban middle-class neighborhoods or our, high schools. Couldn't happen here. Or, the pandemic right now with diseases, the world has never seen anything this horrible. No, the reality for many of us as BIPOC people, we faced it with smallpox or measles that annihilated indigenous populations. And all those issues around military occupation by aggressive neighboring countries. Remember Japan and Korea. And if you're concerned about how bad environmental racism is in shaping oceanic policies, ask the people around Vieques. And if you're concerned about, where did these oligarchies who are siphoning natural resources come from? Right now, today, in our own backyards, we've got issues around oil pipelines, transferring oil from one part of this continent to the other. So living in HESED is to accept a sacred calling. Truth and justice require a great deal of work. So I want you to pray in the direction where you want to see change. And when I say that, I mean literally, I want you to turn around wherever you think the fear is coming from or the evil is coming from, where you can tell where your enemies are. Turn there when you pray. And as you listen and learn, remember that all stories come to us as gifts, and they should be received with gratitude. So I thank everyone who has been able to share their stories with us today and throughout this day, because in stories we make connections that we're all related. And as we realize that we are all related, we can be transformed to remember, to be humble enough to feel our remorse for all that has been broken or lost, forgotten, or stolen. And then, in our own way of humility, we need to repent, but together we need to repair, reconcile, and move our whole community to resurrection. From where the sun stands, way up in the sky, we're just a little tiny spot in the universe. So to the sun, it doesn't matter how many questions you have, or how uncertain you are about what to do, or what's even making you uncomfortable. But for the sun and for me, what matters is that you are here and we are here together. This mission to repair and reconcile is one that we cannot wrestle with alone. We need each other. So let's make sure that we walk with each other, listen better, see clearer, and understand the relationship among all things. Remember, we are all connected together. Let's never forget the invitation to live in HESED. Thank you.
Elona, thank you so much for your words this morning. You've given us many ideas and issues to think about. For anyone out there over Hopin, feel free to put any questions in the chat that you would like to pose to Elona. And I'm going to kind of bring it back a level because I know there's some people joining this conference that may or may not have much experience with even some of the things you're bringing up here. So one term I would like you to just either briefly explain or explain for people who it might be a new term to hear is the idea of environmental racism.
Right. So in our understanding of the world, the environment is is the place. It's the way this home of the world, the earth, surrounds us. But policies and decisions made over centuries often have been consumptive policies, that decisions around where water quality will be changed, or how many fish there are in a body of water, to go out and catch, or what plants will actually be put in the ground as seed. Those decisions are often made to be able to benefit some people. And unfortunately, the people who will not benefit from that often have not been there in the process of creating those decisions. So environmental racism means that, in fact, the loss of your home due to, flooding, or that a dam was put up so that other people may have their waterways to transport their boats, but your entire village may be gone. When that's been based on the fact that people of color, indigenous people, tribal people, were just considered as collateral damage in advancing civilization and all the benefits of what it would mean to act together to extract resources so that some people would gain wealth to support armies or to feed the armies. That's a challenge for us because these things are centuries old. When I mentioned the pipeline, there were treaties that existed even, let's say 100 years ago, where the recognition was that that land would always be available for a particular tribal nation. But what we know is that then when there were decisions being made by, let's say, an Army Corps of Engineers about how to put a dam on a river so that, the water control would be determined, they didn't bring that tribal nation into the discussion. The Kinjua Dam, back east, I was just reading about this earlier this week. The entire reservation is underneath the hundreds and hundreds of feet of water, under that dam, even though there was a treaty that said you couldn't do this without talking to these Native people. We know that in the Pacific Island right now, some of the issues around climate change are truly impacting those people who live where their lifestyle is right on the beach. But as the waters rise in the ocean, they're losing their entire village. They're losing the land, actually, the land base of their island. And when they say, help, stop this, because they're marginalized people and they don't have the power to sit in the assembly halls where, elected officials and corporate decisions are being made. It's just like, well, we'll just say goodbye to that island. You people can move and maybe, find another place to live. So the environmental racism really means is that we are once again discriminating or hurting people because their interests are less than a dominant culture.
Thank you for that response on that. Thank you for that response. Our next question is coming from Hoppin. So anybody over Hoppin, feel free to ask a question over the chat. This question is, I was really struck with the idea of cultural hitchhiking. Could you give us some more examples of what that looks like? So that's a new term as well, the cultural hitchhiking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in the last year, driving around, how many places did you see the signs Black Lives Matter appear? People were putting them up on their car windows and in their front lawns and in offices. They were buying posters where they could, put that right on the front door. But what were they really doing around the issues of, liberating Black people, changing the justice systems to actually be more just for people? What were they doing around the issues of brutality within our systems, and how city councils and county sheriff offices, were making decisions around, training practices that ended up hurting people. But, we put up those Black Lives Matter. That's kind of like, you're just kind of hitchhiking around. You're wandering through the highway of a community. You're not engaged in the work of that community. We saw the same thing with a lot of the massive marches. It really is wonderful when in our solidarity, we can come out by the thousands. So I'm not questioning that. But then when you go home, and the next thing that you use to swipe your credit card with is maybe a company that's not hiring people of color, or who's not investing in those communities, you've just basically hitchhiked through that work, that awareness, that experience, but you didn't commit any time or any part of yourself to really change and transform so that you would be better prepared and authentic in your involvement. It was a great term with a lot of satirical wit. Over the last couple of years, if people have talked about, oh, that's just another hitchhiker, because they couldn't really trust everybody who showed up to continue to be part of the struggle.
That's a great explanation, Elona. Thank you so much for that. I was thinking of like that, just the bittersweetness of protesting in itself,
Yeah,
because you feel all the support and of the people that are there in the community of knowing people who feel like you do and believe like you do. But then it's bittersweet because you don't want to have to be there protesting whatever you're there protesting for.
right.
And so this, yeah, cultural hitchhiking is like another way of sounding like to like kind of explain performative, when people are performing but not putting into action what they're doing.
And some of it's by accident. We always talk about, you know, if there's a dog in the house, you show up at a meeting with a lot of dog hair. It's like, oh, that dog hair was hitchhiking on my jacket today. That's also, I think, kind of what happens, is that by accident, people find themselves engaged in, conversations. You're walking through the hallway and people are, really talking about, they just read some great book, or, heard a spoken word artist, and you just kind of wandering through. So it's by accident. But if you don't come back to that and say, what can I learn from this? How much more work do I need to do? You just really were like dog hair on your backpack. You just kind of hitchhiked through.
New analogy for me now too. All right, let's see. Continue to put some questions in the Hopin chat as we're going. Our next question is from Hopin as well. It asks, how may a theological school acknowledge the native history of the land it sits on? Landmark, plaque, annual ceremony, and I'm going to add to their question, and how do we make this not performative and put into action?
Yeah, for real, right. So it does mean there's no one single approach. And we, as Native people, we always say, we don't think linear. So there's going to be multiple things that people can be doing at one time, but you've got to do some research. The horrific stories of finding the graves at residential schools, even though families may have talked about that for decades, it didn't become a truth or real until the technology of being able to do a scan over the landscape to detect that there were graves with bodies in them, and likely the children who died at those residential schools. So, somebody needs to be able to say, let's take our technology. Is the technology something where we have electronic or the digitized, records in our archives? Can we start really looking up to see where this land came from? How did we acquire the property where our campus sits? And if we were in a previous location, how did we leave that and come here? Who had the capital resources to help us invest in the change? Some of you know that, Princeton did an audit on racism on their campus because of the issues of, students years ago used to come to our Ivy League schools and bring their slaves with them. We also know out of our native history that a number of those schools actually started in colonial times as schools that were inviting native students, native young men, to come. Nobody talks about that in terms of our Ivy League schools. You know, we always think about the colonial settlers' sons, but people don't realize that a lot of those schools started to bring native young men as a way to, quote, introduce them to civilization and ameliorate the threat of, you know, we're arriving and taking your land here. And so, yes, maybe plaques that are available, which give a nice snapshot of a particular piece of history that people don't know. I would also say, though, continuing to participate with those communities now as live people. We're not just like exhibits in a museum anymore. You know, that's the performative side. So we'll put this up and we'll recognize who used to be here. We're not going to think about, so what happened? Why aren't they there now? There are a number of church-based schools, which would include seminaries, where decisions were made by like the National Board of National Missions to send missionaries to a certain place to start educational facilities. Those histories need to be recognized. And I would say recognize them in ways using artwork, lecture series, fund like with your series, put the funds together so that annually or quarterly, you can introduce people to your community who are sharing this history. Make it alive in that way. Don't just isolate it to something that's a historical moment. Make it real and personal, at this time. But the good thing is, and I'll talk about this later in worship, there's a lot of things that, maybe have been hidden for a while, but we can't hide them any longer. These things are emerging around our historical truths. And the more that we can recognize that and bring it to a place where it benefits the people who were harmed, that's going to be really important.
Thank you, Elona, for that. Our next question is also coming to you from the Hop In chat. This one asks, if it's not too personal, which means you say no, right? Could you describe the sacred space you have created for yourself?
Mm-hmm. So if anybody has come to my synod office, and Marta, I don't know that you've ever been there, but you walk in, I've got, my artwork on the walls. I've got greetings from different tribal nations and using, their traditional language, around on all my shelves. In fact, my shelves are filled with, the authors and the contributors coming out of, many, many diverse groups. I have sage, I have a shell in several places in my office with sage and sweetgrass and cedar. I make sure that when somebody walks into my office, or even when I'm on a Zoom in my office, they're seeing indigenous space all around me. And that's just my office. But I love the sacred spaces in my community. So we have a number of opportunities here in the Twin Cities with Jim Bear Jacobs. Some of you know, he offers through, his work at the Council of Churches and the truth-telling process, sacred site tours, so that there's an opportunity for people to come together and they travel around in the metro area and learn more about the origin of the Dakota people here and our relationship to the Mississippi River and the water. But you can find, places like that all around you. Put tobacco down when you realize that there's a particular space, right, maybe in your neighborhood, where a highway maybe arrived that has a significant historical aspect, where cultures came together. Put tobacco down or pray in that spot. Like I said, pray to face your enemies every day. Make the space around you wherever your feet touch. Recognize that below you is a millennium of history, so wherever your feet touch the ground, that should be a sacred moment. Yeah, those are just some examples. Yeah.
I like the insight. I love the insight. And no, I haven't been to your office yet, so I'm hoping someday. Um, the next question also from Hopin, so keep those questions coming over chat and Hopin. What biblical scholars and theologians would you recommend seminarians read and seminary classes integrate into their curriculum? Especially
I
being the
had to laugh because I was on a Zoom call recently and somebody asked that same question. It's like your mind goes blank. You know, I would be better prepared if I offered lists, but I think our challenge is to be able to say, how do we share this information? Because there's so many scholars right now, or narratives that were captured in some way before maybe somebody was actually doing an interview, but that their words and their thoughts have been recorded, and we need to have access to those. In our own denomination, we struggle because it just is, people only know a handful of us. So I'm not a writer. um, and we know that the best way to participate in learning is to engage in that process of listening and learning together. But I could send to you, Marta, a list. Vine Deloria's whole collection of books, would be incredible, because he talks about spirituality, he talks about native traditional spirituality. He addresses, the world through a legal mind. He also is very knowledgeable about, his Dakota people and policies that have impacted us. He's gone now, but we know that his collection of writings is very important. George Tinker over at Iliff in Colorado has a number of writings. Steve Charleston, who's been a bishop, has a number of writings. I'm surrounded by books all over the place. Braiding Sweetgrass. I just blanked on the woman's name. That's been a very popular book. As a biologist, she shares the use of medicinal plants from native people, but that perspective of it's not there to just consume, it's really there to heal, and how we have to have relationships with everything growing around us. But I'll work to send you a list. But it's really important that, one of the things, we need to decolonize our commercial bookstore space and our library space. We need to look at the Dewey Decimal System that often identifies, the native collections in history, never puts them over like in science or contemporary realities. The Dewey Decimal System, the numerical system, is identified to put us back. If you're looking for history, that's where you'll find native people. No, we're still here today. We haven't gone. We're still here. But I think that's important. If you go into a bookstore, you start looking and getting better acquainted with our writers. And I would say, particularly as Indigenous contributors, people often don't separate themselves between their whatever their academic or professional discipline is and their spirituality. That's in all of us, because that's who we are as people. So you'll need to get acquainted with a variety of Native people, because they all don't just put a little sign out and say, I'm a Native theologian. In fact, they're very unlikely to do that. Yeah.
All right, we have a couple more questions still coming in from Hopin, which probably will be our final couple, depending on how far we go with it. So the next one from Hopin asks, as an older white male that will be ministering to people that look like me, what advice do you have to help restore wholeness to all others in the human family while naming the undeserved and unearned privilege that they have?
I think it's underserved. Yeah.
Underserved.
Not undeserved. Yeah. Integrating within your normal setting aspects of other people's experiences, creating your space, becoming more diverse. So in worship, make sure that you're introducing, songs that maybe be tribal songs or out of African American music, whether it's, spirituals from the past or contemporary music. Um, the instruments that you play, don't just assume that the organ is the, you know, epitome of civilized worship. Maybe what you need to do is share other experiences for people so that they're just being introduced through immersion in a way to be able to say, I can appreciate that. I know that we have a number of congregations all across the denomination and other denominations where people will make sure that they invite, Native students because they've gotten involved locally in scholarship programs or, work programs. And so they're not bringing people in to like show them off again, like I said, being on exhibit, like you're a display out of a museum, but actually saying these are things that are important in our community here. And, because we all can't go where they are, we'll bring them here, but we'll follow up to go where they are. That's one of the things I think that's so important, even within our white congregation. Don't just think that your space, your walls, to become more diverse, you have to keep bringing people into your space. It's really important for you to leave your space and go out in the community, eat in their restaurants, shop at the stores that have, their Black run businesses or Asian run businesses. Engage yourself in that community. Have a first name basis relationship with people in your community or talk about those things. Most school districts have Indian education programs. Go on the website and see what books they're offering, students and study that. Dakota Presbytery here has an incredible partnership with Baltimore Presbytery. There are probably more churches in Baltimore Presbytery that know Dakota words and Dakota songs out of the hymnal and know, in fact, where South Dakota is on the map because there have been people there partnering together over many, many years. Trust has been built up and these relationships now are very personal. So, it's like, that's your new auntie or your grandparent, those relationships. It really is, and be conscious all the time around your privileges. So it's out of your privilege experience that you need to do something. But don't let your privilege blind you to assume that everybody's had the same experience you've had. And like I said, be cautious around, these phrases and statements that you make because, they're microaggressions. When you talk about, well, I'll just say it. Growing up, we would have people who would say, "What are you?" And Marta, you probably have had people ask you that, and then they don't believe whatever you say, and so they respond with, "No, what are you really? Are you from here?" And when we'd say we're native, I'm born in Philadelphia, they would say, well, you can't be because all Indians around here are dead. You must really be something else. So, I guess they think in some kind of, I don't know, alien construct, that was a courtesy statement or, something that, was okay. It was caustic. And so, just be conscious of, again, some of those statements that we make that are really microaggressive and have been recorded as being microaggressions. So, and I know you've got one more to
I do,
ask.
I do have one more. So briefly, how do we reimagine and understand evangelism in a way that does not repeat the sins of the past?
Study, listen, learn, practice.
Amen.
Get out from, where you've been learning information about evangelism. Really take a look at what missionaries were doing. Missionaries weren't just preaching the gospel, they were introducing lifestyles and changes that said you can't be Indian anymore, or you have to become a white farmer, or we're here to introduce you to civilization because your people are less than that. No, our people had our own governance. We were survivors. We were living in this land. We were doing pretty well until the missionaries and the military came. But I think, again, it means get out of the space that you're in and continue to listen, learn, and practice.
Amen. Amen. Well, Elona, we thank you so much for your time this morning, and we look forward to your message and closing worship with us later today. At 11:15, everyone, workshops will be taking place in the Sessions tab over on this side, the Sessions tab, with Dr. Gregory Cuellar and Reverend Steve Miller for the first session at 10:15, and later at 11:15 with Reverend Jennifer Cumberbatch and Kyrie. Oh, sorry, that's at 10:15 is the first one, and 11:15 for the second session. The tabs, once again, will be over here on this side for the rest of the conference, and we'll meet back here on the main stage for closing worship at 2:15. Blessings to you all today as you remind, restore, and reimagine.